Welcome back, listeners, to another episode of The History Blokes, where we discuss interesting stories, facts, and people from Australia's past. We're talking to you from Ngunnawal country here in Canberra, and this is our 8th episode. I can't believe we've made it here, Conan.
No, that's right. It's very exciting.
Indeed,
very exciting.
Indeed. And on introductions, we should introduce ourselves as well.
Yes.
I'm Chris McKone.
I'm Conan and and what are we talking about today, Chris?
Oh, today we're talking about an incredible Australian invention that a lot of people wouldn't realise is in fact an Australian invention.
Yeah.
But it is an invention that unfortunately makes the news more often than we would like.
Correct.
And what is it, Conan?
Yeah, it is. Yes, it is the black box flight recorder. And I assume you want to get straight into explaining to the listener that you are in fact a pilot.
Yes, a pilot in training. So I'm currently completing my private pilot's license. I fly planes I suggest probably don't have a black box in them. They're very, very small. But yeah, it's a lot of fun.
Yeah. So you'll be able to bring your own experiences to bear on today's episode. That's good. So the black box flight recorder, Chris, as you know, was invented in 1957. So obviously the reason we want to talk about this is because it is an Australian invention with huge implications for air safety around the world, with many thousands of lives saved as a result. And it has, in itself an interesting history of development, and it's reflective too, I think, of Australia's attitude towards innovation. Which we'll get to in due course. But
is that where we invent a lot of things but don't commercialise anything?
Yes.
Damn.
Yes.
The Australian curse.
Yeah, quite. A bit depressing, to be frank. But first, the quiz. Chris, as you managed to shoehorn in very early on in the episode today that you are a pilot, so you should be getting all of these perfectly correct. First one's relatively easy. What are thrown into jet engines to test their ability to withstand bird strike?
That's a very good question. I don't think this has come up in the private pilot's license exam. So I'm going to say, okay, three things. And the way these things tend to work is you start with something small and you build up to test, its threshold, where it breaks. So I would suggest wrens, goose, and then ostrich. What do you think?
I think you're on the right track in the sense that an actual bird is thrown into these engines, but it is a chicken.
I knew you were going to say chicken. I presume not frozen.
No, not frozen and not alive.
Thank heavens for that.
And they actually fired out of what is called a chicken gun, and you can YouTube this. It's a bizarre sight.
I'm going to have to YouTube this straight away. And you, listener, if you're not YouTubing this immediately after this podcast, I'd be very surprised. I think this sounds hilarious.
Oh, and on a slightly serious note, I should say that we are obviously going to be talking about air crashes today, not in graphic detail. So if that might be triggering for people, so just bear that in mind. In other words, switch off now. Or you might want to wait to the end of the quiz. What is the world's oldest still operating airline?
Okay, I'm going to say Qantas.
It's a reasonable guess. It's not
pretty close, surely.
It is
over 100
close.
years. Yeah,
it's KLM.
Is that right?
According to the crappy website. I mean, I'm not as rigorous with my research in the quizzes as I am with the rest of it. So
you wait till we get to the intermission.
Yes, we want to see some really slipshod work.
I'm making a serious effort to not go to Wikipedia for anything.
Well, no, this is definitely correct. Who was the first person to break the sound barrier and when?
Okay, I think that was 1953 in the X1.
I've got 1947.
No, I'm sure that was the case. I have no doubt. There was some speed records broken in the X1 in 1953.
And who...
I have absolutely no idea.
Really? So you haven't read the right stuff?
In short, no.
Chuck Yeager.
Oh, of course. Yeah, I do know Chuck Yeager.
I will give you full marks for that because you got the X1. And you're right, that's what it was called. It was a very simple aircraft. I think it was rocket.
Yeah, correct.
Yeah. Dropped out of the bottom of a bomber. So it got up to a reasonable speed, and at height, it was just dropped out and then hit the rocket booster and off he went.
It's pretty incredible when you think about it, because years before, just a handful of years before, it was all propeller-driven planes. So we've gone from that to a rocket
Yeah.
faster than the speed of sound plane in like literally a handful of years. Incredible.
And he did it with a broken arm or broken clavicle or something, because he'd been horse riding the night before with his wife, came off the horse, broke something. So he had to climb down from the bomber into the X1 and then close the hatch.
And no one noticed that he
Well,
was
he
there.
took an NCO aside and said, "Can you rig something up?" And this guy just snapped off a broom handle and created a simple device so that Jaeger could lever the hatch shut with his other arm, his functional arm. And this is an example of the right stuff. The idea that if you are a test pilot, you've got that inner fortitude.
Grit. That's grit.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
It's like, they can do this stuff drunk if necessary.
That's a great story.
They don't recommend it, but it can be done if you have the right stuff.
The right stuff being 12-year-old Scotch.
Yes. So when the oxygen masks drop down, how long would the air supply last?
I'm going to say 1 hour.
15 minutes.
15 minutes. Really?
So that's enough time. So usually it's because, there's depressurization. So the aircraft can go down to a much lower altitude in that time.
So it's just basically, it gives them enough adjustment time. Yeah, okay, that makes a whole lot of sense.
Yeah. Okay, so into the black box itself.
You know what thought you were going to ask me?
What?
What colour is the black box?
Chris, what colour is the black box?
I'm going to say black. No, it's orange or something.
It's orange,
yes,
yeah.
Cool.
Apparently, it's unclear why it was ever called the black box. It was never black. It was always been orange.
Wow.
Yeah. My theory, based on no research, just my own theory, is that I think it's just like a slang term because black's associated with death. So it might have been just like a bit of gallows humour to describe the flight recorder. But that's probably nonsense.
If any listeners have any idea of the origin of the term black box, please let us know.
Yeah, that's true, yes.
We'd love to hear from you.
We are, of course, on Instagram, so communicate with us that way, while at the same time following us on said social media platform and liking, worshipping us on your podcast platform. Now, Chris, the whole issue around flight recorders originated as early as the early 1950s because of the de Havilland Comet. Have you heard of that, Chris?
Yeah, I have heard of the plane, but I don't know much about it, but I have heard of it.
It was the first commercial jetliner.
Okay, sure.
Invented by the British. Now, so that was launched in 1949. The problem with the Comet is that it was fast and comfortable, and it really caught the imagination of the public, of course.
Mass transit in the sky.
Mass
Incredible.
transit and jet propelled. Very exciting. Because obviously this was the very early days of jet propulsion. But unfortunately, from 1952 to 1954, 7 comets crashed, resulting in the deaths of 110 people. And in many of those cases, the aircraft simply disintegrated at high altitude.
Just because they were British built?
I was umming and ahhing about whether to say that. So thank you. Because I don't want to disparage every single British invention.
I think that the secret here is not because it's British, obviously, but never, ever buy the first model of anything. Don't get in it, don't drive in it, don't fly in it.
So the problem was it was disintegrating at high altitude with no survivors, no witnesses, and no immediate clues as to what had happened. So in 1954, the entire fleet was permanently grounded, and the most comprehensive air crash investigation ever undertaken began. Now, and they eventually found that the crashes were caused by metal fatigue, due in part to the aircraft's square windows. So that's why we now have oval windows, because obviously curves are stronger than corners.
Absolutely.
So meanwhile, in Australia, the Department of Civil Aviation had held a meeting during this investigative period of experts to discuss the possible causes. And one of these experts was a 28-year-old chemist called Dr. David Warren. And he specialised in aviation fuels at the federal government's Aeronautical Research Laboratories, or ARL, in Melbourne. Now, a little bit about David. So he was born in 1925 at a remote mission statement on a remote mission station worked in the APS too long, on Groot Island. I think that's how you pronounce it, in the Gulf of Carpentaria.
Indeed.
And he was the first European child to be born there, interestingly. To ensure he got a good education, he was sent south to boarding school down in Sydney and in Tassie. And unfortunately and ironically, in 1934, David's father was killed in one of Australia's earliest air disasters, the loss of the Miss Hobart in Bass Strait. Poignantly, the last gift he gave to his son, David, was a crystal set and primitive radio. And David really became hooked on electronics, although, as I said, went into chemistry. So if you can imagine a whole bunch of experts sitting around trying to work out what had to happen to the comets. But the problem is there was insufficient data. And this was the thing that really struck David Warren, was that how can we really meaningfully discuss what happened when there's just too little information to go on. It's so speculative. He also realized that often the people best placed to have known what might have caused the crashes were the flight crew, who were, of course, all tragically dead. And this is, I suppose, the defining feature of the flight recorder, right? So it's very important not only to know what the instruments were saying, what the controls were doing, but also what the pilots were saying, what ambient noise there was in the cockpit.
I mean, all this makes sense, Conan. I mean, otherwise, how do you learn and improve and ensure any of this stuff doesn't happen again?
Yeah.
Without that information, you're just in the dark.
And that specific information is important because 80% of crashes involve a human factor. So you really need to know what the people, the flight crew, were doing and saying. At the same time, he remembers seeing a curious device at a trade fair a few weeks before. It was a German-designed dictaphone that recorded sound on steel wire rather than magnetic tape. And it occurred to him, of course, that while if you had a device on a plane that could withstand the trauma of a crash, then that would obviously be enormously useful. Magnetic tape probably won't cut it; it would melt. But a steel wire would not. And we're talking about very fine steel wire, like human hair or less. Now, flight data recorders did exist at this point, and that was being used for some military test aircraft, but it wasn't being used on other military craft, and it definitely was not being used in commercial planes for crash investigation purposes. So importantly, the voice recorder had not been invented at all up until this point. And at that point, David Warren wrote a memo to his manager suggesting that ARL, where he worked, develop a voice recorder, pointing out that it is often essential to know what the pilots were experiencing and why they made the decisions they made. Because obviously, they're chatting amongst themselves. You might hear a bang in the background. So in fact, the Lockerbie crash, the terrorist attack in the 80s, they were able to hear over the voice recorder the sound of the explosion. And I don't think that information was available on the data recorder. It was only available on the voice recorder. So what he was proposing was that you simultaneously record the voices and noise in the flight deck with flight data and save it into a crash-proof container. He also made the point that as aircraft continue to fly faster and higher and further, crashes will become more common, not less. And that the need to understand why they occurred became correspondingly more urgent.
Yeah, I mean, you've got basically kind of all the forensic in one package, don't you?
Yeah.
Because you've got all the information you need other than perhaps the physical evidence.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
No, incredible. Gives them clues and gives them a place to start, I suspect, when they're doing these sort of analysis, unfortunately.
Yeah, so this is the memo he sent to his senior staff at the ARL in April 1954. Just a sentence from it. In investigating accidents, anything which provides a record of flight conditions, pilot reactions, etc. for the few moments preceding the crash is of inestimable value. But as you said before, Chris, this was met with indifference. Yeah.
Classic bureaucratic indifference.
Basically, superiors expressed just limited interest. And they said, look, yeah, okay, sure, pass it on to the instruments section. But the problem was that they were overstretched, so it was sort of put on the back burner. And Warren had to, well, he'd been a teacher before he became a professional chemist, and he knew that show and tell is generally more effective than just tell. So what he did was he started working on a prototype in his garage on the weekends. And so 3 years later, 1957, he finally came across a new supportive manager in Tom Keeble, who encouraged him to write a more detailed paper for distribution amongst aviation authorities in Australia. And Keeble also found £600 to pay for a professionally built prototype based on Warren's garage job.
Like so many of these stories as they relate to sort of great inventions and so on, it's as much about just finding the right people to support the development of the thing, the idea, as it is about the idea itself.
Yeah, so things do have to sort of fall into place. So the device, once it was put together, was recorded 4 hours of flight deck sound. it recorded 8 instrument readings 4 times a second. So quite primitive, really, at this stage. But all on the same...
4 times a second's pretty quick, though.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
that's quite impressive sampling. Remember, much of what would have gone on in those days would have been all analog type flying as well. So actually being able to convert that to something that's recorded is actually quite a feat.
Yeah, yeah. So yeah, and all on the same durable, very fine steel wire. And the great thing about it was that it required little maintenance. It turned on and off automatically with the aircraft's engines and was self-erasing unless there was a crash. Now, Warren's paper advocated that the flight recorders be installed in all major aircraft. You know, he was able to sort of foresee people's concerns about it. So he addressed these concerns about its weight, about the size, about the cost, pilot privacy, and maintenance.
About the fact that it isn't black.
Yes, that's right.
He just called it a flight recorder.
Yeah, well, exactly, yes. And that's a good point. He was very keen to avoid the use of the word crash because of the negative connotations.
I can see why.
Yeah.
It's kind of like taking out, floor 13 from room 13 from your hotel rooms.
Well, that's right, yeah. Because he knew that he's going to have to do a bit of a sell job on this. So, but also the device, I mean, I don't know if this is still the case. I'm sure it is. But it's not just used for crash investigations. It's also used for maintenance purposes because it keeps a record of an entire flight and all of the sort of...
That's right. How the plane responded under certain circumstances, under certain types of flying and management and so on.
Yes,
that's really important.
And it's a way to monitor how the crew are behaving as well.
Indeed.
And there's been talk of sticking video cameras in cockpits, but the pilots' unions won't have that. So, and in fact, that privacy.
Is it because we're going to find out how little they actually do?
Yes.
Once they've taken off.
Well, I think we all know that there's a fair amount of snoozing.
I think there's a bit of an autopilot button there that kind of probably gets you most of the way there.
Do you have an autopilot in your?
No,
Really?
no. If I took my hands off the yoke, for example, I would just die.
You are an intrepid fellow, aren't
Thank you.
Nothing would get me. I did do a flight simulator on an A330 flight simulator thing. It was fun.
Yeah.
And I discovered that flying these things is quite straightforward. Much more so than people think. It's just that, I guess, if you do make a tiny screw up, the consequences are bleak.
One thing that learning to fly in a light plane does inoculate you from is nervousness around turbulence. After you've been jolted around in a small plane, the minor turbulence... in one of the larger planes is really quite minuscule.
Is it dangerous being in a flight?
No, not really. You kind of get used to the fact that you can have turbulent conditions, but it doesn't actually affect your flight trajectory. By and large, the little jolts, not going to knock you off course.
Yeah, I don't like turbulence. As I get older, I don't like it. But I know it's fine. And yes, it's a good point. And it's for listeners who are like me a little bit alarmed by turbulence, don't be. But do wear your seatbelt. Where was I, Chris? I was talking about...
We got to understanding how the planes were performing in addition to the crash investigation.
That's right. So he addressed concerns about weight, size, cost, privacy, and maintenance. However, despite all of this, despite having a superb prototype, a detailed paper covering all of this stuff, it met with a complete lack of interest, even hostility in Australia.
God, that's so Australian, isn't it?
Yeah.
You got an idea that might change the world? Yeah.
Yeah. That's right. And part of that was because there had been relatively few air crashes in Australia, so there wasn't a sort of perceived need.
Qantas still has that record, doesn't it?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, obviously there had been crashes, like his father had died. And there was a perception, too, that Britain and the United States were the centres of aeronautical innovation, not Australia, so we shouldn't be sort of mucking around in big boy territory. And the Federation of Pilots were concerned about privacy. So Keeble and Warren then sent the paper to relevant organisations overseas, but even then they failed to receive any meaningful response. And in fact, this is this is what the Australian Civil Aviation Authority said in 1958. Dr. Warren's instrument has little immediate direct use in civil aircraft.
And our planes never fall out of the sky.
That's right. And even the RAAF took a similar view because they saw plane crashes as just part of the process.
Wonderful, isn't it? It just happens, guys. It just happens.
We're not interested in why or how to prevent it from happening.
You're in God's hands.
That's right.
You're in God's hands. Yeah.
So, Chris, on that bombshell, I will hand over to you for the intermission. So let's go to a little dribble of Mozart.
Okay, Conan, given Dr. Warren conceived of the black box in 1953, I thought I would take a look around other inventions, even discoveries, at that same time that are noteworthy, that are worth having a little bit of a chat about. And hopefully we'll find some that are either interesting, profound, or a little bit light-hearted. And I'm going to cover off on perhaps all three of those things. In 1953, a small company in California invented and released WD-40. What do you think the WD-40 means as a name?
Good question. I have very briefly wondered that in the past.
Very briefly, I suspect.
Yes, I have no idea.
Okay, so WD means water displacement.
Okay.
And 40 is simply it was the 40th attempt to produce something that worked. And they were trying to develop a water-displacing lubricant for the aeronautical industry. Oh. So they established it then, released that at that point, didn't bother to give it a sexy name, and then it all just kind of grew from there. And interestingly, WD-40 really came into its own following a series of hurricane-induced floods in the early 1960s, and there were these photos of truckloads of WD-40 being shipped out to these affected regions, basically to get their flooded cars, sort of kicked off and started again. Okay. Amazing. And I was using WD-40 just this afternoon. I've got a can of it just in the cupboard next to you, Conan. So it's everywhere, isn't it, really? It really is everywhere. There are some 2,000 official uses of WD-40 developed by its fan base, but formally released some 10 or 15 years ago.
Are you angling for free cases to be sent?
I am hoping.
The manufacturers can contact us on Instagram.
I am hoping so.
Why didn't you promote Scotch or something like that? Well, I don't want WD-40. Jeez.
Well, that involves you actually having to do something DIY related, I suspect.
Exactly.
So that's the kind of interesting one. So now we'll move on to the silly.
Boring.
Okay. Around 1953 as well, what was being marketed in 1953, what was invented and marketed in 1953 was what was called the monopod seat. Effectively, it's a stool with one leg, and it's a little seat on it, and you just wander around, and then you just plant it on the ground and set it up and just take a seat. You're standing in line, just set it up, take a seat. Yeah. You're watching the cricket, just set it up, take a seat, and just stay balanced, of course, on the seat. Yeah. And you just take it wherever you're going, and it really took off. Yeah. Because I'm fairly sure nobody uses them today and hasn't since about 1954. Okay, so now I'll go on to my third. I was going to call invention, but it's not an invention, it's a discovery. And this is the profound one. Oh. I'm going to tie together three elements for you here. A pub, flying,
yes,
and a profound discovery, which has changed science forever.
Okay.
Effectively.
Wow.
Okay, great.
Bold promises.
Bold promises indeed. And this is a pub. There is a pub that I have drunk at in Cambridge. Yeah. It is called the Eagle. Mm-hmm. Okay, Conan, so on the 28th of February, 1953, regular to that pub, Francis Crick announced to everyone in the pub that he and James Watson, his partner, had just discovered the secret of life, or the double helix structure of DNA. And of course, DNA had been known for some time. And by the way, what does DNA stand for again?
Deoxyribonucleic acid. Gotcha.
I'm very impressed. Did you just Google that?
No.
And their discovery had been supported by analysis undertaken by a lady called Rosalind Franklin, who essentially was undertaking X-ray crystallography to get the images of, I guess, of the double helix. And so, from the work of Rosalind, they're able to deduce the structure of DNA, but importantly, how DNA replicates.
And we should say that Rosalind Franklin was sidelined and received very little credit.
That's right. Exactly. All right. Okay. So now the connection with flying. So in this pub also it was frequently visited by airmen back in World War II, and they took to the airmen burned their names using cigarette lighters into the ceiling of this pub. So so essentially the ceiling is all covered in these airmen's names. So not only is it famous for this incredible announcement back in 1953. But also, it's famous because there's got all these airmen's, I guess.
Well, you're an
names.
airman. Did you burn your name?
No, I didn't. There wasn't enough space on the ceiling. I wasn't an airman at the time.
So but you would now.
I did get very drunk in that pub, though. I do recall that. But anyway, so that's my 3 fun facts for you, Conan.
Excellent. Thank you for that, Chris. Let's have some Wolfgang Amadeus M. So, Chris, we left David Warren, no doubt feeling a bit glum because no one was taking up his ideas. However, this is where we were talking before about just the right person at the right time. That person was Sir Robert Hardingham, who was a former Air Vice Marshal, Secretary of the British Air Registration Board.
So basically not an Australian.
Not an Australian, yes, indeed. In early 1958, he visited the ARL, and during the tour, the ARL's Chief Superintendent, Lawrence Combs, introduced Hardingham to Warren, who showed him the flight recorder. And Hardingham was very impressed with the recorder and invited Warren to bring the device to the UK, which Warren did. Warren spent a month there, went on the BBC, introduced it to various aviation authorities and manufacturers, and it was greeted with great enthusiasm. But there was one manufacturer that was not interested. Ironically, most plane manufacturers thought it was a great idea, but
wasn't the plane, was it? The one that had had the crash that
Yes,
inspired
yes,
all of this. Oh,
yes.
my goodness.
De Havilland.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And in fact, such was the level of interest that it began a movement to make flight recordings mandatory on all British civilian aircraft. And in fact, on his way back to Australia, Warren visited similar organisations in the US, but was met with little or no interest, which is interesting, given that it's the centre of innovation. But when he got back to Australia, the ARL, having registered the support that Britain was giving Warren, they decided to throw resources at him. He was given a team, and I'll name these people: Lane Sear, Ken Fraser, and Walter Boswell.
And by the way, this was because other people were suddenly interested.
Yes.
Therefore, they needed to be interested.
The British were interested.
It's so very Australian.
Well, yes, and particularly back in the 50s, under the Menzies era.
The British are keen.
Yeah.
Oh my God, it must be good.
Yeah. And yes, it's an issue we come back to over and over, Australia's relationship with the mother country. So all those three guys were from the instruments section we've referred to in the past, and they, along with Warren, developed a pre-production standard prototype which was completed in 1962. And this device's recordings were a great improvement on the 57 prototype. So it could read 24 readings a second, and it was fire resistant, shock-proof, and it had a ground-based decoding device. However, the ARL did not apply for patents. And many of the design elements were already out in the public domain.
So people just picked it up?
The Americans picked it up.
Oh. Maybe there's a story like this, similar to the seatbelt. For the public good, Volvo made the seatbelt patent available to all.
Oh, did they?
Absolutely. So maybe, either unbeknownst to him, for the public good, his design was out there in the world to be used.
Well, yeah, the internet is another example of that, isn't it? And so the Americans in particular seized on this technology and began to make a mock so as it was becoming mandatory around the world to install these things. And in fact, do you know the first country in the world to make the installation of them mandatory?
Well, I'd like to say Britain, given the history.
The British were pretty much almost there, but they were not technically the first country.
I'm going to say France.
Australia.
No way. Oh, my goodness. Well, that we do very well. We regulate.
Yes, and we're good on safety.
We are.
And the reason why it was here was because a Fokker Friendship crashed in 1960 in Mackay, where everyone on board was killed. And the inquiry judge strongly recommended that they be installed in all airliners, so it became law. Mind you, it was 7 years later, but so all's well that ends well, except that, yeah, as you said, Australia didn't make much money from it. We did make, however, some, and we made 1,000 British pounds back in the 50s or 60s.
1,000 British pounds. However, we changed the industry, regardless of, where the money flowed to, change the industry. Yeah. And that information, I have no doubt, has been absolutely invaluable.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
I still think we're rubbish at commercialising things, but yes.
Yeah. Yeah. And yes, quite apart from the broader issues of brain drain and lack of support for R&D and whatever. And just to be clear about what we're talking about here, so flight recorders, they're either orange or yellow. They're designed to withstand massive trauma from high-speed impact, intense and prolonged fire, immersion in salt water at crushing depths, which is why, presumably, if the MH370 wreckage is ever found, hopefully the flight recorder will be intact. So there's actually two devices, the cockpit voice recorder, or CVR, and the flight data recorder, or FDR. And they're roughly the size of a brick, and they are occasionally combined into one unit, but usually they're two. Still wires no longer used, it's digitally recorded, of course. And they're housed in the tail of the aircraft, which is less likely to be damaged in a crash. And I believe it's also a bit better for passengers to be at the back of an aircraft too. Slightly better chance of surviving a crash. So, and to aid in recovery, a locator beacon signal is emitted for up to 30 days. Yeah, so there you are. I don't know if that works underwater though.
Yeah.
Future improvements for flight recorders include the possibility of transmitting flight data in real time to ground stations, which would obviously eliminate the need to physically find the devices, which obviously would have been of enormous value with the MH370 disappearance.
Incredible, yeah.
It'd be interesting to know whether that leads to that. And some of them are designed to self-eject from the plane at the moment of impact.
Really?
So in the last 4 decades, 100,000 flight recorders have been installed in commercial aircraft.
Incredible.
Yeah.
And who's making the money from that?
That's a good question. Yeah. As I said, well, it certainly isn't in Australia, unless individual companies are making them. Now, David Warren didn't even get much recognition for this until the 1990s. It was only in 2002 that he was awarded the Officer of the Order of Australia.
Brilliant.
Yeah. It's great that he got it. I mean, he died. He died in 2010, but it's great that he was. I like to think that he derived enormous satisfaction for the lives he was saving. Yeah. So no, he's good on him. He did a great deal. So, what are your key learnings from today, Chris?
Well, I think I've learned quite a bit. Actually, or have I? Or have I learned? I've learned that we're good on ideas, not necessarily very supportive in bringing them to fruition. Whilst we've changed a bit, we haven't changed as much as we need to as a nation. But I think, in terms of Dr. Warren's own work, I think it was very impressive. The lengths he went to get people to listen. And that's been quite a common theme, I think, looking at a number of the issues that we've gone over as part of this podcast, the polio and the nurse that went to the US to look at kind of physiotherapy and other things. I mean, people that have just kind of driven it themselves, and I think that's really kind of highlighted how important the people are in these stories as much as kind of what they do and what they invent. Yeah,
that's right. I'm sorry you didn't get as much chance to talk about your piloting as you might have liked.
That's quite okay, given the context is black boxes.
Fair enough. Well, I thank you for... the key learnings I took, Chris, were that WD-40 stands for water displacement, and the 40th attempt to come up with a version that works. That was slightly interesting.
Only slightly, though. Yes. I was struggling on this one.
And interesting that turbulence doesn't even worry light planes. So that will make me...
minor turbulence. Minor turbulence.
Well, that will make me a lot more relaxed when I'm in a A380 or whatever, and it's bumping up and down and everyone's freaking out around me. Chris, our next episode will, of course, be on Anzac Day. Chris, will you be getting up at the crack of dawn?
I will be there at dawn on Anzac Day.
Yes, Chris's face indicates that he will not be doing.
But then I have a flight at 6 a.m. that day. I'm fairly sure I'll be up at dawn. Indeed, absolutely. No, looking forward to it, Conan, and to all our listeners. Thanks again, and we look forward to speaking to you again in a couple of weeks' time.
Sounds good. Until then, everyone, goodbye for now.